Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to go over Cathie Wood and her ETF company, or I guess her asset management company, ARK Invest. Let me give you a little background about my knowledge of Miss Wood. I didn't really know anything about this lady, didn't hear anything about her. Actually, probably the first time I ran across the name was maybe about, I don't know, maybe about 4 or 5 months ago. Several months ago, sometime in 2021, I believe. I don't recall when. Today is February 2nd, 2022. Now, I have mentioned her a few times recently in some of the webinars. Obviously very critical of this lady. In a certain degree, it's similar to, the situation is similar to, in more ways than one, Elizabeth Holmes. That is to say, I wasn't aware of Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes, any of the claims, until there was already some trouble, potential trouble in the works, reported in the news. I hadn't heard about her, similar to Cathie Wood. And the reason why, folks, is that I don't pay attention to the media, right? So those of you who know about these things, maybe you should ask yourself the question if you're wasting your time with the media. Now, apparently, and I did a recent audio I made on Elizabeth Holmes, and as I mentioned in that audio, I didn't hear about her. I didn't hear about her company until just a few years ago, when there were already problems, and I just couldn't believe, if I had, and apparently, I think most people that had heard about the company heard about it, I guess initially through CNBC, Jim Cramer, and then of course, it makes the media circuits, the financial media. But if I had known about this lady and her claims for her company, I would have come out very boldly and very definitively, and I would have claimed that she's a scam artist. It's a fraud. It's that obvious. I have a extensive background in the sciences, in the physical and the biomedical sciences, and I'm not sure that you need one, other than maybe to know what are some of the things that you have to know. There's no way some 19-year-old kid, I don't care if she graduated from chemical engineering, biomedical engineering, I don't care. If she got a master's, I don't care. PhD, it's all impossible. I talked about that. You're not talking about something very simple here, like a Facebook or Airbnb, right? You're making a website and you leverage the collection of your cabal to get everybody to promote your website, to promote your business. That's what happened in Facebook. I've talked about that. Airbnb, the same. And of course, not only that, but Airbnb's case, and actually Facebook, they've used their connections in their to get away from criminal penalties and to bribe officials to allow the criminal business of Airbnb. Same thing with Uber. I'll go ahead and mention now, because I might forget, the whole thing with Cathie Wood, and I'm sure some of you, maybe most of you, know more about her than I do. I just typically don't waste time on things that are just, I already know the plot. I already know how it's going to end. And but Cathie Wood's whole pitch is amazing innovation, disruptive innovation, right? And it's funny because I don't think anyone said kind of the obvious, and that is, this is a lady who embraces, worships disruptive innovation, disruptive, innovative companies. That's her investment theme. Yet, I will guarantee you, if Theranos had made it to the IPO process before it was exposed as a scam, this would have been one of Cathie Wood's top holdings. I can guarantee you that. She would be the first person to buy it in the stock market. But anyway, My point behind that is that you have this lady who basically was I guess maybe second or even potentially third tier equities analyst at a small firm, a boutique firm. Now, I'm not quite sure. I didn't do the background. You can look into it. Apparently, she's from AllianceBernstein. And I would say my guess is that she's probably from the Bernstein side. I don't know how long she was there, 10 years, 15 years, what have you. But I'll go ahead and tell you, I do know AllianceBernstein, and I've talked about this recently in another audio, and that is basically, this was due to the merging of Alliance Capital, which was a rather large mutual fund company, and Bernstein, which is a kind of asset management boutique company, very small. Alliance Capital was a very large mutual fund company back in the .com period. But what happened was with a lot of these mutual fund companies that were heavy tech, another one I remember that grew was very large. It was really small, but it became very large due to its very aggressive bets on the technology stocks, .com period, was a mutual fund company called MFS. I think MFS Global. And I think they ran into some problems as well. But Alliance Capital, and I told this story before. I go ahead, I guess I give it a quick rundown on the story now. But I remember Alliance Capital because I was actually involved in advising the company, advising some of the fund managers when I was working at Bear Stearns. And there was a particular call that I remember, and I haven't thought about it much, maybe 5 times over the course of 20 years. But I hadn't really thought about it. But considering, how long it's been, it's still pretty close to my memory. I remember exactly where I was. And I can see myself in the library area of Bear Stearns, where I often took a lot of my calls. And it was during that period, by the way, that I really realized and understand I didn't have a whole lot of experience. I was a new guy. This was about when I was talking, I was advising, I had landed some big customers, some big institutional customers, from executive management of Fortune 100 companies to, large mutual fund companies. Alliance Capital had to have been top 5 mutual fund in terms of size at that time. I also was working with some large multi-billion-dollar pension plans. But anyway, and also corporate treasuries. But I was still new. I don't know anybody. I'm not bragging or anything because it's not a big deal. It's a sales job basically. But I don't know anybody who had been in the industry for as short a period of time as I had and landed institutional clients. I wasn't in the institutional division. I was in private client services, right? So I think that it's safe to say I had a very promising future in that business if I had chosen to stay. But I was pretty disgusted with what I saw in the .com. That's a whole nother story. And I got the hell out when discussed. I didn't want to be part of that criminal industry. And I didn't just leave that firm. I left the whole industry. Anyway, so had this call, particular, it was a discussion with one of the fund managers. And it was during this period when I really came to understand that you've got kids in charge of billions of dollars of people's money, other people's money, through managing funds. And also, now of course there are many individuals involved, but you're talking about, say, one large mutual fund has got hundreds of positions. So obviously there are dozens of guys who can pull the trigger. I would have to say this fund probably had a large handful of traders that were pulling the trigger, making decisions. Then you have the portfolio managers, you've got risk management, you've got compliance, so on and so forth. But it was during this period in my discussions with these individuals, not only at Alliance, but also Union Planners is one of the pensions that I was dealing with. I believe that was in Tennessee. But I was kind of shocked to learn that you have largely clueless kids, in their late 20s, maybe early 30s, that don't have a fucking clue what's going on. Now, granted, this was a period, the dot-com bust. It was, nobody really understood what was going on a whole lot. But you can say the same thing about the financial crisis, right? So it's not as if you're talking about once in a lifetime. You're going to have these periods periodically where very few people have an idea what's going on. So you have people there in charge of these huge funds that are clueless. But anyway, let me get to the point and let me just move on now. I don't want this to be about Alliance, but the bottom line is that fund manager was asking me, wanted my opinion. They were the number one shareholder of WorldCom. You can look into the company if you don't remember it. MCI WorldCom. They had about 100 million shares, I do believe, at the time. And, this had shrunk down from, I guess, a stock price of maybe 60, 70 bucks. So you can imagine we're talking about a cost basis probably of several billions of dollars. And when we were speaking on the phone, I believe it was around $4. So they were looking at around $400 million. They were the number one holder. And this, understand, WorldCom was a major company, very large market cap, but, it encountered a lot of problems. And the fund manager asked me point blank, do you think I should buy more? I was, he told me their situation, and I said, hell no. And that was it. I didn't, I just said I would stay away from it. And immediately when he asked me that, I remember thinking to myself, like, you're going to add more. This is a penny stock now. That's a whole new ball game. You guys could get in trouble for that, right? Well, turns out WorldCom blew up, went bankrupt. You can look into it. Accounting fraud, Bernie Ebers, and it's an interesting story. I'm sure you can find a documentary on it. But turns out that I didn't follow the case, but I think a few years later I noted that Alliance got sued by at least one state from the pensions that they were managing because of their irresponsibility in WorldCom. I mean, think about that. And nobody knows I was behind the phone trying to stop them from blowing up. And by the way, I got not a single penny. So this guy, he wanted to buy, and what ended up happening is they doubled their stake. They doubled down. He wanted validation. He wanted somebody who was going to validate what they wanted to do, right? He wanted to hear someone to cheer him on. And the reality is that if I had agreed to that, said, yeah, sure, I could have probably, if not have gotten some of that trade executed through Bear Stearns with me to get the commission on that, then certainly I'm sure I could have gotten future trades if I had agreed to that. And I wasn't going to do it. I didn't realize at the time, but probably nobody else in my shoes would have done that, because all they care about is making the commish, the money, right? But it's kind of interesting when you think about it. You're talking about billions, tens of billions of dollars at stake, because not only the $400 or $500 million that Alliance decided to throw away, more than doubling its stake on WorldCom, but also the lawsuit that ensued because of that, and many other problems that the company faced, which I think this is why they merged with Bernstein, by the way. So the point, getting back to Cathie Woods, is it's not as if she was some big-time analyst at Goldman or JP Morgan or something. Even if she were, these analysts are not that impressive. So that's a whole nother topic of discussion. I'm not going to get into that. So you have Cathie Wood, at least, she has been in the industry a long time, which is good. She should have a general understanding of what's going on from many aspects of things, right? From a operational standpoint, obviously as an analyst, you should be able to responsibly put together a strong, legitimate team of researchers, of equity analysts, and of risk managers, to come across with some good research. Now, one might assume that that is the case. You look at the website here, and you can see your disruptive innovation ETFs, how to invest. And so we'll just briefly look at her ETFs. So you have ARK Innovation ETF, and this is the one, well, I guess many of them are in trouble. ARK Innovation is down by, I think, a little more over 50% from its highs about a year ago. ARK Next Generation Internet ETF. And of course, the ARK Innovation is the largest of the group here. ARK Genomic Revolution ETF, ARK Autonomous Tech and Robotics ETF, ARK FinTech Innovation ETF, ARK Space Exploration, ARK 3D Printing, ARK Israel Innovative Technology, ARK Transparency ETF. So, and excuse me, by the way, if I'm reading this maybe not exactly, because I'm sitting back kind of relaxing in my chair. But the one thing I'll go ahead and say, folks, is you got to understand something, okay? And this is the value of having a financial advisor. Now, if you're buying these ETFs, most likely you're buying them on the market. You're not dealing with a financial advisor. And the value in a financial advisor, if they're responsible, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you're going to get a responsible financial advisor at a discount brokerage. You may or may not, but I wouldn't bet on it. But if you're with going through a financial advisor and they actually are responsible for your account, that's another reason too, by the way. It's not necessarily that let's say, the Schwab brokers aren't maybe, although generally speaking, I think it's fair to say they're not going to be as experienced, they're not going to be as competent as a full-service broker. There's always going to be exceptions, right? You're going to have some incompetent dumbos working at J.P. Morgan Chase or where have you. And you'll have some more competent, more experienced individuals working at Schwab. But it's mainly that it's a different business. So if you have an account at J.P. Morgan or Goldman or Merrill Lynch, then you're assigned a broker. And that broker is responsible for you. Not only is he getting the direct commissions or a cut of them, but he's responsible for you, right? Whereas a discount broker such as Schwab or TD Ameritrade or Fidelity, they're not. There's no responsibility there, and they don't have as much experience typically, so they may not say, hey, you know what? If you're dealing with these ARK ETFs, be careful because they're very concentrated. They're high-tech sectors, right? So first of all of these ETFs, for the most part, are high-tech. So you're dealing with a large amount of risk. Second of all, you could argue that aside from the somewhat cyclical nature of technology, and certainly high volatility of high-tech, high growth, you're also dealing with the other issue that these ETFs are very focused, right? Next generation internet ETF. So this is internet, genomics, and this is autonomous, robotics, right? So my point is that I think it's going to be a little bit risky to buy and hold. There's going to be certain periods, that are going to be better, certain periods are going to be riskier. So that's the first thing that you should note. The second thing is that if you look through these ETFs, you're going to see that most of the holdings, they're smaller market cap and they're newer companies, and many of them don't have earnings. So that's going to be very risky, okay? Very risky. Make it more volatile. This is some of the discussion that you should be getting if you are going through a financial advisor, okay, to help you understand the nature of the risk. So let's go ahead and take a look at the ARK Innovation so you can see. Okay, so it's down to 16 billion. So you can see, I'm not going to go over the performance because that's a whole other topic of discussion that could take many hours discussing risk-adjusted performance. You could talk about many other things, but just briefly, you can see and I guess this is going to be, so since inception, I'm assuming this means this fund has been around for more than 5 years, let's say maybe 6 years or so. So it looks pretty good, right? But of course, timing can be very important. You can see if you got in a year ago, it's down, by 20, it looks like 23% from where I'm at. And, unfortunately, I think unless there are some radical changes made, I think it's going much lower. I mentioned this to several people last year when it was around $95. I said, I think it's going to 50 or lower. But so you can see the top holdings here: Tesla, Teladoc, Zoom, Roku, Coinbase, Exact Sciences, Unity Software, Spotify, Intellia Therapeutics, and Twilio. Tesla's been kind of like the one-hit wonder, and that has been, I'm not going to even get into Tesla. That's a whole other topic of discussion. This is more, I think, more than 50% of the portfolio, these 10 stocks. And so that's a little concerning. Now, the one thing I'll say about these ETFs and mutual funds, you'll notice that oftentimes you'll see companies that aren't necessarily that related. They can always make an argument that they are related. But what they'll do, though, is they'll kind of window dress them. What I really wanted to talk about in this video is I wanted to go over her staff. But before I do that, you have to understand, and I haven't even seen all the pictures. I've seen maybe a total of 20 seconds of pitches of they pitch you all this innovation. Innovation drives growth, right? And you know what, folks, that's not necessarily true. Innovation is certainly a key to certain types of growth, but you have many different steps from innovation, right? Innovation doesn't, if it's innovation is the key, then just go and invest in a bunch of university labs, right? R&D labs. After innovation, you have to have commercialization, right? And the steps to get from innovation to the market, to a business that's generating revenues and ultimately making a profit, that's a big process. So, you have to understand it's not just about innovation. I've seen some incredible innovative firms not do shit. So keep that in mind. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention before I get to the main focus, and that is, of course, we're going to take a look at her staff. And, this is a lady who doesn't have a technology degree, nothing, or I guess, science-based. When you hear a technology background, it would have to be somebody that has an expertise in technology. And then, of course, that's an open can of worms. What do you consider technology, right? I wouldn't consider software programming a technology, understanding technology. That's not understanding technology. Certainly, if you have an expertise in IT, you understand some things about technology. But if you're looking at a lot of the things here with her investments, I would say most of it has to do with, on a core level, physical sciences, biological sciences. You can see, 3D printing obviously is pertaining to science applications in manufacturing, but obviously where does 3D printing come from? I've told this story a few times before, and that is, people heard about 3D printing. I guess the bubble maybe was, 10 years ago or 8 years ago, something like that. And I was just kind of laughing because they acted like it was something new. And I saw a 3D printer 30 years ago, had an engineering department that was being used for automotive engineering. So it's been around a long time. Of course, Cathie Woods is going to tell you, oh, but you don't understand. It's rapid, innovative improvements that we're seeing now makes it really relevant. And that's all a bunch of nonsense. That's what her whole pitch is about, is that she claims that the convergence of all the innovation, the speed at which the innovation is occurring, and the convergence of all these different technologies, we've never seen it before. That's a lie. Who are you going to believe, folks? You're going to believe somebody who understands business, understands innovation, has a very comprehensive background in science, physical sciences, physics, chemistry, biophysics, biological systems, biological processes, material science. who are you going to listen to? You're going to listen to somebody with that background who's also a research investment analyst. Okay, he's been around probably close to about the same time as she has, who's not here selling you something. I'm not pitching a fund. Or you can listen to her. I mean, it's just shocking to me how she can talk about genomics and her little kids that she's got working for her talk about genomics or teledocs. Excuse me? You're listening to probably the first person who actually wrote a book introducing the layperson to telemedicine in 2009. Me. Prior to that, I was working in venture capital in telemedicine and healthcare IT. So who are you going to trust? Who's going to know more about this stuff? And I don't even pay attention to it. I know how it's all positioned in terms of telemedicine and healthcare IT. I'm not going to get into that now. But my point is that if I'm not pitching these stocks, then she is. She knows more than me. Well, you say, well, Mike, she's got a whole staff, right? A whole staff of analysts, right? And people who don't know me, let me just go ahead and tell you, I don't waste time on stuff that is a no-brainer. If I don't see something there, I'm not going to go in there and prove to myself in detail that there's nothing there. Life is too short. I'm too busy. There's too many things going on. If I spot nothing there, I move on. And I gravitate towards things where there's more certainty. Okay? I'm not always right. Maybe I miss some things. That's fine. But I don't blow up like Cathie. You can see her funds are blowing up. So let's take a look now. Let's find out. You can go ahead and read all this nonsense. I mean, look, folks, Cathie Wood is a con artist. I think that she's a con artist, and I think that she is ignorant, an ignorant con artist. If the two designations can coexist, I think in her case they certainly can. This is like used car sales, is what she's doing. And I'm going to release something here. I told people I was going to release it before. Matter of fact, let me go ahead and show you here. There you have it here, folks. So I remember this report back when I was working at, this was Payne Weber, which was bought by UBS. And Ed Kirshner, I remember this because this was a big deal in the industry. My friends who worked at Smith Barney, they were dying for this, the cassette recordings for this and the research. And this was the big, Ed Kirshner was the chief investment strategist of Payne Weber. This was released, I think, in 1998. And it was a sales pitch. Is all it was. This is what Wall Street does, folks. And they had a theme, the New Millennium American. And of course, this was based upon the acknowledgement of, and this is probably to some extent, I think Harry Dent probably attached himself to this, the boomers, right? The baby boomers. And it was based upon all of these little mini themes that were focused on the baby boomers. And they give you this really nice narrative, and you can see how long it is here. It's how many pages? 22 pages. Go through and read the whole thing, and they go through and tell you what stocks they recommend and why and what's going to happen and this and that. And we'll go ahead and take a look at the page here, the page recommendations. So you can see here, and it's not, it's not out of control actually. Given this was towards the peak of the .com, you can see it's not a tremendous amount of high-tech stocks. There's a lot of really good names there, right? But the point is that this was all driven by this whole theme, right? And, Cathie Wood's done the same thing essentially, except it's almost as if it's almost as if she should have launched her ETFs 25 years ago. Because we were hearing during this time, understand folks, I think that the human genome was sequenced around 1999. There's a lot of excitement in the air. And understand that, not only was I working on Wall Street, but also understand that I was involved in a lot of biotechnology private placement deals, private merchant banking deals. So I was doing that stuff. If you look at Cathie Wood's theme, it's all about high technology, right? So you would think, well, you know, she's high on genomics. She's got a genomic ETF, right? Well, the excitement was actually back in 2000, right? There's a lot of excitement. Of course, she's telling you now that, you know, now it's you know, the genome was sequenced 20 years ago, and now it's so much cheaper, right? Things are converging. There's a big explosion, a revolutionary explosion in innovation, and da-da-da-da. That's all bullshit. The claim that we are seeing this very rapid acceleration, or however she words it, of innovation is just not true. It's not true. I want her to prove it to me. It's not true, okay? It's just not true. They were saying the same damn thing 20 and 25 years ago. Everything's different this time in terms of the internet, how it's changing business, and valuations don't matter, and all this other stuff. And I've been talking about this actually in the research for ever since September 2020, when Powell came out and basically said, okay, we're not even going to think about raising rates until the end of 2023. And once he said that, boy, we saw bubblicious behavior, wild speculative behavior, which was problematic. It was a problem at that period for sure. So anyway, let me get back now to Cathie Wood. So why innovation? 3 reasons why we believe ARK ETFs should be represented in a portfolio. Invest in the future. It's changing lives and businesses and creating opportunities. Capitalize on inefficiencies. We believe the opportunities resulting from disruptive innovation often are underestimated or misunderstood by traditional investment managers. Okay, so Cathie's telling you that her and her monkeys are the smartest guys in the room. That's what she's saying. Are you fucking kidding me? Really? Wow. How arrogant. How arrogant. The third reason why you need her ETFs in your portfolio: make the world a better place. You can do it. You can hug the trees and save the whales. Give me a fucking break. I mean, this is like she's a used car salesman. So here's the executives in addition to her. Bill Cox, Treasurer and CFO. Kellen Carter, Chief Compliance Officer. Chief Legal Officer, Secretary, and Tom Stout, President. Now, I think Tom Stout is also the Chief Operating Officer. In fact, I'm sure he is, because I have an image I saved of him. Let me show you the image here. Once I find how to get to these profiles, I'll get to all these profiles. So take a close look at Mr. Stout. He's the COO, and he looks like a little kid. Mommy, mama, mama. Right? I mean, I'm concerned. If he's the COO and I have my money at this firm, I'm fucking scared, okay? He's a fresh college grad. He graduated college not much more than a decade ago. He's what, 32, 33? And look at his experience. Actually, not even 10 years ago. Not even 10 years. So he was an intern for 2 months at Fidelity as a kid. Student broadcasting, play-by-play announcer. Well, I think maybe that's going to come in handy. You can do a play-by-play on Cathie Wood's performance on a daily basis as it collapses. Well, here we have coming in Tesla's now collapsing, and then we have Teladoc's also collapsing, and then Lansing Club. Okay, great. And then we get to his only work experience before joining Cathie Wood. He was an account executive. In other words, he was a sales guy at a radio station, at a weather station. What the? Folks, you got your fucking money with Cathie Wood's investment firm. I say you pull it the fuck out ASAP. And if you got it there, why in the hell didn't you research this to begin with? You've got a kid who's the chief operating officer. And his only experience, work experience prior to that is he worked at a weather station. I mean, you can't even make this shit up. Nobody would believe you. And in addition to that, there's not a single risk management professional on her staff. Nobody managing risk. All of the analysts they're inexperienced. They don't have any experience. They're similar to the Stout guy. It's shocking. Folks, we're talking about a disaster. You've got a bunch of naive kids who drink the Kool-Aid. I don't know what's going on. I mean, I do know what's going on. Cathie Wood is going to hire a bunch of competent, experienced analysts. She wants naive kids, kind of like the military, right? Fight for your country. Be a patriot, you know. Swallow the bullshit. She doesn't want intelligent, experienced analysts because they're going to say, Cathie, what the fuck is going on? What are you doing here? She wants naive kids that don't know their head from their ass. And they're going to accept everything and they're going to spout out all the bullshit that she feeds them. Yeah, okay. Innovation stocks are not in a bubble where they're in deep value territory. This was written when? Well, Cathie, yeah, I don't think it's turning out. And it's amazing to me, by the way, this lady who continues to claim that, you know, deflation, that's going to be the problem. It's a fucking idiot. And she doesn't understand, obviously, or she's in denial that her stocks are going to get hit the hardest by an increase in interest rates. And that's already being reflected in the stocks, in many of the stocks right now. That's why they've collapsed to a large degree. There's many other reasons, of course.
There are two fundamental reforms that we need is to get adequate capital and two, to get far higher levels of enforcement of fraud statutes. Existing ones, I'm not even talking about new. Things were being done which were certainly illegal and clearly criminal in certain cases, which, I mean, fraud is a fact. Fraud creates very considerable instability in competitive markets. If you cannot trust your counterparties, it won't work. And indeed, we saw that it didn't.
So things went very well, and then the economy collapses. And so all of a sudden people are saying, well, it was Alan Greenspan's fault because he should have anticipated this. Did you think that was fair?
Nobody forecast the 2008 crisis. One of the things I put in the second book I wrote was how the IMF missed it, the Federal Reserve missed it. You go down a whole series of the major forecasting.
Well, everybody got it wrong, let's say.
You can't have a crisis of that nature that is not a surprise. Nobody forecast the 2008 crisis. One of the things I put in the second book I wrote was how the IMF missed it, the Federal Reserve missed it. You go down a whole series of the major forecasting.
Well, everybody got it
organizations.
wrong, let's say.
You can't have a crisis of that nature that is not a surprise. Nobody forecast the 2008 crisis. Nobody forecast the 2008 crisis. Nobody forecast the 2008 crisis. There are two fundamental reforms that we need is to get adequate capital and two, to get far higher levels of enforcement of fraud statutes. Existing ones, I'm not even talking about new. Things were being done which were certainly illegal and clearly criminal in certain cases, which, fraud is a fact. Fraud creates very considerable instability in competitive markets. If you cannot trust your counterparties, it won't work. And indeed, we saw that it didn't. Certainly illegal and clearly criminal in certain cases, which, fraud is a fact. Fraud creates very considerable instability in competitive markets. If you cannot trust your counterparties, it won't work. And indeed, we saw that it didn't. Certainly illegal and clearly criminal in certain cases, which, fraud is a fact. Fraud creates very considerable instability in competitive markets. If you cannot trust your counterparties, it won't work. And indeed, we saw that it didn't. There are two fundamental reforms that we need is to get adequate capital and two, to get far higher levels of enforcement of fraud statutes. Existing ones, I'm not even talking about new. Things were being done which were certainly illegal and clearly criminal in certain cases, which, fraud is a fact. Fraud creates very considerable instability in competitive markets. If you cannot trust your counterparties, it won't work. And indeed, we saw that it didn't. Nobody forecast the 2008 crisis. Things were being done which were certainly illegal and clearly criminal in certain cases, which nobody forecast the 2008 crisis. 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 Nobody forecast the 2008 crisis.
terms of getting back as an investor, if it's coming down to here, almost irrespective of what's going on, I have to believe, if I have to make a call in advance, and of course I can change depending on what happens, but I have to believe this is where you want to start doing that 18, 17, around there. Their earnings report is a complete game changer, at least for quite a while. Bottom line, NVIDIA now is going to enter the realm of Tesla, Apple, and all these other big, I mean, listen, NVIDIA can come down to 150, come down to $100. If you don't think it's possible, then you don't understand how the market works. I mean, listen, NVIDIA can come down to 150, come down to $100. If you don't think it's possible, then you don't understand how the market works.